This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel's ground offensive. Operation Protective Edge enters a dramatic new stage. After weeks of rocket fire, Israel looks to stop Hamas from bombarding its population. Plus, the view from an Israeli official, a resident on the border, and CBN senior international correspondent George Thomas. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you from the Israeli-Gaza border the morning after Israel's ground campaign began to eliminate rocket fire from Hamas-controlled territory. Here's a look at how it started and why. Israeli tanks and foot soldiers crossed the border fence into Gaza late Thursday evening, as seen in this footage from the IDF. The ground operation began several hours ago, and except for the occasional flare, Gaza City is locked in total darkness. And in that darkness, Hamas and Israel are locked in a life-and-death struggle. From midnight to mid-morning Friday, Israel attacked more than 100 terror targets throughout the Gaza Strip. The morning after the ground campaign began, explosions are still being heard from Gaza City as the IDF continues the next stage in Operation Protective Edge to stop rocket fire from Hamas-controlled territory. The IDF sent messages to Gazans to leave their homes in areas near the border and places of fighting. They warned them Israel would be using massive firepower. Israel says the goal of the extended operation is to uncover terror tunnels, destroy the Hamas infrastructure, and return quiet to southern Israeli communities.
The goal remains the same. The goal is to protect our people. I mean, over the last 10 days, we've had some 1,500 rockets fired by the terrorists in Gaza against our people. We've had barrage after barrage on our cities. And we are taking action, as I think any democratic government would do, to protect our people.
Friday morning, Hamas continued to fire rockets at southern Israeli communities, sending Israelis to their shelters.
Hamas have to be on the run. They cannot be an authority that is responsible for the Gaza Strip and expect to carry out terrorist attacks against us. They have to realize that there is a price to pay when you stand behind, initiate, and engage in terrorism.
For now, Israel seems to have limited backing from the international community. Even Egypt blamed Hamas for the ground incursion, saying that Hamas had refused attempts at a ceasefire. Earlier this week, we talked to an Israeli official about a number of issues relating to Operation Protective Edge. Okay, Paul, we're now in Operation Protective Edge. Where is Israel right now in all of this?
Well, we're back where we didn't want to be in the first place. From the 12th of June until the 7th of July, there was a significant uptick in the number of missiles, rockets being fired into Israel. And during that time, we said clearly, we said repetitively, we said it openly, we said it privately through diplomatic channels, calm will be answered by calm. This was a message which was received and was rejected out of hand by Hamas, and we were left with no choice but to go in and to put an end to it ourselves. A war that we were dragged into that we didn't want to be in.
Do you think there could be a possibility that there would be another proposal for a ceasefire in the near future?
We're desirous for a sense of calm, but we're not in the habit of committing suicide. We're not going to shoot ourselves in the head. So yes, maybe that'll come up again, and maybe we'll give it another try, and maybe we'll give it a third try and a fourth and a fifth. But you know, each time the question is, how long do we sit back and absorb another 47 rockets in 6 hours, and maybe it'll only be another 38 in 4 hours, or maybe it'll be 200 in a day. And at some point, you know, the government has got no choice but to put an end to this.
Being in the foreign ministry, what kind of reaction have you had from nations regionally as well as around the world, from Europe and the US?
I think that the international community is seeing again that Israel is willing and determined to activate moderate force in the face of real threats. Yes, it's true, there's a lot of violence, and the worst part of it all is that civilians are being killed and injured on both sides of this conflict. But that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to put an end to it. As my Prime Minister said, we're facing a situation where we're using missiles to protect our civilians, and we're up against one of the darkest schools of thought in modern political history, which is using its population to protect its missiles.
One thing that has been coming up in the whole situation is the fact that there's almost 200 or maybe more Palestinians have been killed. Very little on the Israeli side, and some people sort of weigh that in the balance, and they accuse Israel of being using too much force. How do you respond to that?
That is because we've invested time and effort and energy and money, a significant amount, in building a defense mechanism. We have air raid sirens, we have bomb shelters, we have a very disciplined public who through bitter experience have learned how to behave in these times, and of course the well-known Iron Dome system. So because we have a successful defense mechanism in place, I'm not going to now turn around and say that I apologize for that, okay? If we're talking of something in the region of 1,600 strikes by the Israeli military and 210 deaths on the Palestinian side, then either the Israeli military is incompetent, or I think, and what I think is the case, that's evidence of the fact that the Israeli military is taking every possible step that it can to avoid civilian casualties.
Yeah. Where do you see this going, Paul? We're now into the second week. What do you think happening, or how do you see this unfolding?
If we want to progress the diplomatic process, if we want to progress towards a peace and reconciliation between ourselves and the Arab world, which is what we want, the primary obstacle in the way to that is Hamas. You're talking about the ideological siblings of these guys, ISIS in Syria and Iraq, the spiritual brothers of Boko Haram down in Nigeria, of the Shabab from Somalia who are wreaking havoc in Kenya. We need to dismantle the terror machine. We need the international community to put pressure to contain the threat, which is done by dismantling the terror machine which has been built up in Gaza over years now. We can't put a band-aid on this for a third time, for a fourth time.
And do you see the possibility of a ground incursion?
The army has been given the instruction by the political echelons to have that option ready. People have been called up, the military has prepared. I'm sure, I'm not a military person myself, but I'm sure there are a number of different alternative plans in place. It's a distinct possibility. I would just add that, you know, in the long run, we are going to resolve our differences, for the very simple reason that between ourselves and the Arabs who've been in conflict now for decades, it's in our mutual interest, it's to our mutual benefit. So we need to keep our eye on that vision of the future, and we will get there.
Thanks for your time, Paul. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, anytime. Thank you.
Up next, we talk with CBN News international correspondent George Thomas, who came to help cover this dramatic new chapter in Israel's history. George Thomas, CBN News international reporter. You've been all over the world. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
You came in last night. Tell me what your first impressions are.
Look, Chris, I think the writing was on the wall. I mean, in essence, for the last 8-9 days, Israel pounded Hamas. I mean, they, you know, perhaps got between 30 to 40 of the various sites across the Gaza Strip. But it was inevitable, because in order to really put a dent to this, they had to put boots on the ground. Right. It was inevitable, and that's what you see today.
Right. And we're just a couple of miles from the troops right now. We've been hearing explosions in the background. We were here pretty much all of last night, watching some of the fireworks going on.
I'm wondering, do you get a sense that this is a month-long, maybe months-long event, or is this maybe 2-3 days?
Well, it could be a month long. It could be a few weeks. It depends. Right now, they say their initial objective is to eliminate many of these tunnels that are in sort of these open areas between Gaza and Israel. Just yesterday, they had an incursion. They had 13 Hamas terrorists come in with RPGs, machine guns. They were going to infiltrate a kibbutz right on the border, and hundreds of people literally could have died. So that's their initial objective. How far they go remains to be seen. If they really want to eliminate the rockets completely, it could take weeks. and they would have to go almost house by house throughout Gaza to make sure those rockets are.
And this is dangerous work right here. I mean, it's almost street to street guerrilla type warfare.
Right, right. The danger is, I mean, you do have unfortunately civilian casualties in an air campaign, but Israeli troops are not at risk. But now the risk really it goes exponentially.
What's interesting is that the global leaders are somewhat silent. They're not necessarily supporting or criticizing Israel, and that speaks volumes, don't you think?
It really does, and I think part of that is the fact that Hamas was offered a ceasefire just a few days ago.
And they refused it.
They refused it, and Israel accepted it. And so I think, at least in perhaps world opinion, international leaders, there's some legitimacy to the fact that Israel can do what it does now on the ground campaign, because there have been about 1,600 rockets fired from Gaza into Israel.
Do you get a sense that Hamas is losing the PR campaign around the world because it continues to use men, women and children, put them at mosques, at hospitals, at daycare centers, and that's not playing well for them?
No, it isn't. If that story gets out, and sometimes I don't think that story gets out as much as it should, that they sort of use their civilians as human shields while Israel does what it can to try to protect civilians. We talked to one Israeli official last night, and he said, ironically, Israel actually does more to protect its citizens than Hamas does by putting them out in the front lines and putting them in harm's way. You know, George, let me ask you about something. I mean, we were stunned after we picked you up at the airport to find out that a Malaysian airliner had been shot down over Ukraine. That's another huge global story right now.
I mean, right now the United States intel is clear. They say that it was a surface-to-air missile that brought down this airline at 292, including passengers and crew. I mean, this is tragic. It's horrific. I mean, that this would happen today, but it happens at a very difficult time because of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the constant desire for the Russians to take more territory inside of Ukraine. And obviously the international press has not been focusing on this part of the world because other crises from obviously here in Israel, but this quickly changes it very dramatically. Two major international headlines: a war and this catastrophic situation.
Let me ask you a final question. You have over 1 million followers on Facebook and your platform through CBN News. How should Christians and believers around the world look at both of these situations in a redemptive way?
Well, a lot of people are focused on Gaza. They're concerned about the innocent men, women, and children that are caught, Christians that are caught in the middle of this crisis. We need to pray for them, pray for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, soldiers, and the entire region. You look at a large swath of the Middle East, from the shores of Casablanca all the way to Herat, Afghanistan. This is a cauldron that is just bubbling, it's boiling, it's spilling over, and the impact of that is tremendous. There's great revival that's taking place in the midst of the challenges. People are turning to the Lord. People are looking for something to believe in. And so, people on Facebook, on social media are saying, we've got to pray. These are moments of crisis. In the moments of crisis, that's when the Lord appears and the Lord touches people.
And do you see this prophetic in a prophetic sense as well? All this cauldron from North Africa to Afghanistan?
I mean, I think part of the prophetic is the fact that the Lord is turning the hearts of Muslims toward Him. He's bending their hearts toward Him, and that's tremendous. From Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, across the Middle East, which is so exciting. But you've also, you're living in the heart of all the prophecy. What do you see?
Well, I see, 2,000 years ago, all roads led to Rome. I like to say that 2,000 years later, all roads are leading to Jerusalem, and the focus of the world will increasingly be on what many people call the epicenter, the city of Jerusalem. I think that's what we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. Great to be on your show.
It's great to be here, George.
Thanks, buddy.
Up next, the view from Sderot, a town under fire for years. They call it the bomb capital of the world. What's it like to live under rocket fire for more than a decade? That's what's happened to the residents of Sderot, a town on the Israeli-Gaza border. We talked to Zvi, who works with a humanitarian organization in a place they call Rocket Town. Okay, Zvi, can you tell me what it's like living here in Sderot?
Well, it's exciting in a way. You know, we have had a lot of action in the last 12 years, and now we have an extra portion of action in the last already 2 or 3 weeks. People are more tense than in other cities, I think, because of the way they were raised under this tension.
And how can you describe to somebody that doesn't experience what you have, describe what life is like?
I think sometimes you can compare it with like natural catastrophes, like in the southeast of the US. But just imagine not having like a tornado season, but maybe all year round.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what do you do here?
We have a charity organization, Hands of Mercy. We help especially the victims of terrorism. This charity started in Jerusalem after the Intifada, and after things got quiet in Jerusalem, the director learned about Sderot, that it never got quiet really, and the city as a whole is victim of terrorism.
There was a ceasefire apparently for 6 or 7 hours, and now there's no more ceasefire. What's your reaction to that?
Being in Sderot, we knew from 9 a.m. that there was no ceasefire, but rather that Israel would have agreed to the conditions of Egypt, but Hamas didn't, because we never experienced the quiet.
And what do you see going on? What do you see happening?
Israel as a whole, I don't see that they want a stop to it. They want to go all the way, because we have already suffered. So even the mayor of Sderot said, we will take the blow as long as the military goes in and just does the job all the way, and not like a year and a half ago where they did just a week and then they just reloaded, and now we experience the same thing.
What will happen? I mean, do you think there'll be a ground offensive?
I'm a little uncertain about that. It will be very costly for Israel as well as for Gaza, a ground offensive, but we want to show that we are ready for it if there is need. But at this point, I think it's uncertain.
What do you say about to the people that they hear reports of, you know, people being killed and wounded over in Gaza because of the airstrikes, and yet some people say there's not that many casualties here in Israel. They sort of kind of weigh it in the balance and they think, well, the Gazans.
We profoundly lament all the casualties in Gaza. We know that there are 1.5 million people living there, and most of them are peaceful people that they want to live in peace. But because of these few dozen thousands of terrorists or extremists, the nation as a whole has to suffer. By the other hand, Israel is one of the few or even only armies in the world that will give you so many warnings to tell people we are going to bomb here, get out. They are trying to target where all the rockets are, so they try to do the best so that they can get people out of the fire zone. And proof of that is just being able to see just 100 civilian casualties out of like over 1,500 airstrikes. Really, if Israel was trying to commit genocide, like I saw advertised in the media elsewhere in the world, we will have now a few dozen thousand casualties if Israel was trying to kill people. Obviously, they are not. And by the other hand, I always wonder why the world as a whole, they don't say anything about 150,000 of Syrians killed, or in other places where there are really genocides taking place or civil wars, and they just focus on 100 people that Israel kills, that is trying to save really, but trying to protect itself.
Right. What's your message to people, let's say, in the US or the West?
The most important thing is get informed, just without any bias. Just look at Israeli sources of news, look at all kinds of news, just to form a well-informed opinion. And if you get to the conclusion, as I'm saying, that Israel really has been suffering these rocket attacks that were unprovoked, and now we are retaliating, we are trying to do away with the problem of terrorism, have an informed opinion, and just support Israel in this time.
Great, Zvi. Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Up next, Israel's anti-missile system a look at Iron Dome. Some call it a miracle. Finally this week, we look at the Iron Dome, the anti-missile defense system. For Israel, it's been a game changer. It's been a game-changing defensive weapon, the Iron Dome.
Every time they are launching a rocket at the State of Israel, they are meeting a brick wall called the Iron Dome.
Some believe it's a godsend that protected Israeli lives.
And I take that as a testament, first of all, to a merciful and loving God, and second of all, to a merciful and loving God who's helped us develop the Iron Dome.
Iron Dome is a miracle, okay? An Israeli miracle. An invention. We've had help from America, Raytheon.
It's remarkable to see the Iron Dome in action. Just behind me, you can see a small puff of smoke. Just moments ago, the Iron Dome intercepted an incoming rocket right on the Gaza border. The inventor of the Iron Dome says many rejected the concept.
I raised the idea of intercepting rockets. Everybody objected to the idea because it looks science fiction. But we established a team, and we get some money, and have started to work. Took us about 2 years to get all the money needed to full-scale development and buying fewer batteries. This is how they start.
To Gold, it was a matter of life and death.
The main purpose is to save human lives, Israeli lives, and also by delaying or not needed to do a massive ground operation, it saved other lives also. And it saved lives in Israel and the other side. So this is the main leaders. Without it, probably we have casualties.
It takes pressure off Israeli leaders.
Another contribution is strategic contribution. The system gives the high political echelon or army echelon time to think. There's Iron Dome, protect Israel, not 100%, but protect Israel, so they can think, they activate, like today, the Air Force or other Air Navy to try to stop it. Without ground operation, they can activate political powers, or they can prepare for war, cold reason. They have time.
The Iron Dome shot down nearly 90% of rockets from Gaza. Though not 100% accurate, it's changed the equation of modern warfare. Thanks for joining us for this edition. As a reminder, many Christians around the world are loading an app on their smartphones called Red Alert. It gives real-time information about when a rocket is fired and where it's heading. And they use that as a reminder to pray for the situation. Well, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next week.